The black snow. I was the one who convinced them to go out that night. Maybe if I hadn't, things would have turned out differently. It started the evening after the first snowfall of December. I was sitting with Ellie, Noah, and Lucas in the tiny diner that served as the town's only social hub. The waitress was refilling our coffee when Lucas looked up from his phone, his brows furrowed. "Have you seen the snow?" he asked. "Yeah," Ellie said, sipping her cocoa. "First one of the season. What about it?" "No," Lucas said, lowering his voice. "It's black, like completely black." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Are you trying to freak us out again?" "No, seriously," Lucas insisted, shoving his phone toward us. The screen displayed a blurry photo of the snow-covered park. The drifts were pitch black, like soot, and the surface gleamed wetly under the streetlights. "That's just the lighting," I said, though unease curled in my stomach. "It's not the lighting," Lucas snapped. "Go outside and see for yourself." We didn't have to go far. The moment we stepped out of the diner, the air hit us, thick, heavy, and sour, like burnt matches. The snow piled on the streets was black as coal, and it wasn't just a thin coating. Every inch of it was drenched in that inky substance, sticky like tar. Noah crouched and hesitated before brushing a fingertip over the surface. He grimaced, holding his hand up. "It's warm," he said. "Snow isn't supposed to be warm," Ellie muttered. We were still staring when we heard the first voice. It was faint, carried on the cold wind, but unmistakable, a soft melodic whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Lucas nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the snow." None of us slept well that night. I kept hearing the whispers, even with my windows shut and my headphones blasting music. It felt like the voices were inside my head, murmuring things I couldn't quite understand. By morning, the news had spread. Everyone in town was talking about the snow. People swore they'd seen shadows moving in it, shapes too large and fluid to be animals. Worse, there were already rumors about disappearances. Mrs. Franklin's dog, Timmy Hudson, the 6-year-old who lived 3 streets over. I met the others at the diner again. The tension between us was palpable. "It's not just snow," Lucas said. "It's something else." Ellie crossed her arms. "Something else, like what? Aliens? Toxic waste? Come on, Lucas." "No, listen," he said, his voice urgent. "I looked it up last night. There's nothing like this anywhere else. The sulfur smell, the warmth, the voices, none of it makes sense." "We need to figure out where it's coming from," Noah said. Ellie scoffed. "And how are we supposed to do that? What? Just follow the snow to its source?" "Why not?" I said, surprising myself. The idea had been forming in the back of my mind all night. There's something weird going on, and no one's doing anything about it. If we can figure it out, we might disappear, like Timmy Hudson. Ellie interrupted. Lucas leaned forward. Or we might stop it before more people vanish. It didn't take much more convincing. By sunset, we were trudging through the woods on the edge of town, following the black snow. The deeper we went, the worse the smell became. My throat burned and my eyes watered. The snow grew thicker here, the drifts rising waist-high. We used flashlights to guide our way, but the light barely penetrated the murky darkness of the forest. "This is a bad idea," Ellie muttered for the 100th time. "We're already here," I said, though I was starting to agree with her. The whispers grew louder as we walked, distinct now. I could make out words, my name, repeated over and over. "I don't like this," Noah said, his voice trembling. Then we saw the footprints. They were enormous, each one nearly 3 feet long, with clawed toes that pressed deep into the snow. They led away from us, deeper into the woods. "What the hell made those?" Ellie whispered. "Only one way to find out," Lucas said grimly. We followed the tracks, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The whispers became a cacophony, echoing from every direction. The trees themselves seemed to lean toward us, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a gnarled, twisted tree, its roots writhing like snakes. The snow around it was melted, revealing charred earth. And there, at the base of the tree, was Timmy Hudson. He stood motionless, his eyes wide and glassy, his lips moving silently. "Timmy!" Ellie shouted, running toward him. Before any of us could stop her, the ground erupted. A figure emerged, towering and grotesque. Its skin was as black as the snow, glistening and cracked, with sulphurous smoke billowing from its body. Its eyes burned like embers, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deep, guttural laugh. "Run!" I shouted. Ellie was frozen, staring up at the creature. Lucas grabbed her arm and dragged her backward as the thing lunged. We ran, tripping over roots and crashing through the underbrush. The creature's footsteps thundered behind us, shaking the ground. Noah was the first to fall. He screamed as the thing grabbed him, dragging him back toward the clearing. "We can't leave him!" Lucas shouted. But when we turned, there was no sign of Noah, only the black snow, rippling like water. By the time we reached the edge of the woods, we were covered in scratches and gasping for breath. The creature didn't follow, but its laughter echoed in my ears long after we reached town. The next day, the snow was gone, not just from the woods, but from the entire town. There was no sign of Noah or Timmy Hudson. The police dismissed it as a tragic accident. A boy lost in the snowstorm, a teenager who went looking for him and never came back. But we knew the truth. I still hear the whispers sometimes late at night. They call my name, beckoning me back to the woods. And I know that one day, I won't be able to resist. The carnival that never left. There was something unsettling about the field at the edge of town. For as long as I could remember, it had been a barren patch of land, bordered by the dark woods. But when the carnival appeared, no one could explain it. One day, the field was empty. The next, it was filled with brightly coloured tents, a towering Ferris wheel, and the smell of popcorn and roasted peanuts drifting through the air. No one in town had seen it arrive. No trucks, no construction crews, nothing. It was just there. My friends and I were intrigued, of course. What kid wouldn't be? The flyers promised rides, games and shows, like nothing you've ever experienced. But our parents were cautious, warning us to stay away. "It's strange," my mom had said, her brow furrowed as she folded laundry. "No one knows who owns it or where it came from." That only made us want to go more. By us, I mean me, Alex, and Sarah. We were inseparable, the kind of friends who stuck together through everything. And when Alex suggested sneaking into the carnival after it closed one night, Sarah and I didn't hesitate. "It'll be awesome," Alex said, his grin mischievous. "No lines, no rules, we can explore everything." We met at the edge of the field just after midnight. The carnival lights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the empty rides and stalls. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the Ferris wheel turning in the wind. "Creepy," Sarah whispered, hugging her jacket close. "Come on," Alex said, leading the way. We climbed over the low wooden fence and stepped onto the trampled grass. The air smelled sweet, like cotton candy. But there was an underlying sourness that made my stomach churn. The first tent we entered was filled with mirrors. It was one of those fun houses where the reflections warp and twist your image. But these mirrors weren't like the ones I'd seen at other carnivals. In one, my reflection was skeletal, my skin clinging to my bones like I'd been starved for years. In another, my eyes were black, my smile too wide. "Let's keep moving," Sarah said, her voice shaky. Alex laughed, but even he seemed uneasy as we left the tent and moved deeper into the carnival. The next attraction was a ring toss game, its brightly painted bottles stacked in neat rows. "Bet I can win something," Alex said, picking up a ring. He tossed it, and it landed perfectly on a bottle. A bell chimed, and a prize slid down the chute. A stuffed bear with matted fur and glassy eyes. "Cool," Alex said, grabbing it. But as he held the bear, his expression changed. His hands began to tremble and his face went pale. "Alex?" Sarah asked. He dropped the bear like it burned him. "Let's keep moving," he muttered, his voice low. We passed more rides and games, each one more disturbing than the last. A carousel spun in slow, jerky circles, its horses frozen in snarling, grotesque expressions. A clown in a faded costume stood motionless at the entrance to a shooting gallery, its painted smile cracked and sinister. And then we heard it, a low, melodic tune drifting through the air. It was coming from the big top, the largest tent in the carnival. "We shouldn't go in there," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. But Alex was already moving toward it, drawn by the music. The inside of the tent was pitch black, save for a single spotlight illuminating the center. As we stepped inside, the flap closed behind us with a snap and the music stopped. "Hello?" Alex called out. No answer. The spotlight flickered and something moved within it. A figure stepped into the light, a tall man in a pinstriped suit and a top hat, his face obscured by shadow. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. "To the carnival that never left." "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man tilted his head, and I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to peer straight through me. "This is where dreams come to die," he said, a grin spreading across his face. The ground beneath us shifted, and the spotlight expanded, revealing rows of seats filled with shadowy figures. They weren't people, not anymore. Their faces were blank, their forms insubstantial, like smoke trapped in human shape. "Run!" Alex shouted. We turned and bolted, but the tent seemed endless. No matter how far we ran, the exit was always out of reach. The figures from the seats began to move, their shapes stretching and twisting as they reached for us. "Over here!" Sarah shouted, pulling us toward a narrow gap in the tent wall. We squeezed through, tumbling onto the grass outside. The carnival was gone. The field was empty, just as it had been before. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, catching our breath. Then Alex spoke. "We need to leave," he said, his voice hollow. We walked back to town in silence, the events of the night replaying in my mind. When we reached the edge of the field, I turned back for one last look. The carnival was there, glowing in the darkness, its music faint but unmistakable. It never left. The Shadowed Lake. When my friend suggested renting a lakeside cabin for the holidays, I jumped at the chance. After months of stress at work, I needed a break, and a remote getaway sounded perfect. The group consisted of 5 of us: me, my girlfriend Sandra, and our friends Derek, Lena, and Brian. We were all seasoned hikers and campers, so a cabin deep in the forest, next to a pristine icy lake, seemed like a dream. The cabin was in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest, far enough that cell service was non-existent, and the nearest town was nearly an hour away. The listing boasted unmatched seclusion and tranquility. It also mentioned that the property included a small boat dock, a rowboat, and trails leading into the surrounding forest. We didn't think much of the cryptic warning at the bottom of the listing. "Please respect the lake. Do not disturb it after dark." We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began dipping behind the towering pines. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and a wraparound porch overlooking the lake. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the sunset. As we unloaded the car, Brian jokingly said, "Looks like the kind of place where a monster drags you into the lake at night." "Thanks for that," Lena replied, rolling her eyes. Sandra and I laughed, but as I stared at the lake, a strange unease settled over me. I chalked it up to exhaustion and dismissed it. We spent the evening around the fireplace, sharing stories and drinking wine. By the time we went to bed, the wind had picked up, making the cabin groan and creak. I woke up sometime after midnight. The room was dark, but I could hear something faint outside, like a soft splashing. At first, I thought it was the wind disturbing the water. But then I realized it was rhythmic, deliberate, something moving through the lake. I nudged Sandra. "Do you hear that?" She mumbled something incoherent and turned over. I got up and peeked out the window. The lake was shrouded in mist, the water eerily still. But near the dock, I thought I saw a ripple, as if something large had just submerged. I stood there for a long moment, staring, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, Derek and Brian decided to take the rowboat out. Sandra and Lena stayed behind to make breakfast, and I wandered down to the dock to see the lake in the daylight. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were wet, large, and barefoot, trailing from the edge of the lake up onto the dock. They stopped abruptly at the midpoint of the dock, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. "Hey, check this out!" I called. Derek walked over, squinting at the footprints. "Weird, must have been a big guy swimming out here last night." "But it's freezing," I said. "Who'd be swimming out here after dark?" He shrugged. "Probably some daredevil locals. You know how small towns are." But the tracks didn't look human. The toes were too long, the arches too high. I didn't say anything, but a chill ran down my spine. That afternoon, while hiking one of the trails, we ran into a woman walking her dog. She was older, bundled in layers of wool and fleece, her face weathered by years in the wilderness. "You staying at the lake cabin?" she asked, her tone oddly serious. "Yeah," Brian replied. "It's beautiful out here." She nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Be careful at night. Don't go near the water. And if you hear anything, don't look." "What do you mean?" Lena asked, frowning. The woman hesitated, then said, "The lake remembers. Sometimes it reaches out to those who disturb it." Before we could ask more, she tugged her dog's leash and walked away, disappearing into the trees. That night, the wind died completely, leaving the cabin in eerie silence. Around midnight, I woke up again, this time to the sound of heavy footsteps outside. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, circling the cabin. "Sandra," I whispered, shaking her awake. She sat up groggily. "What's wrong?" "Listen," The footsteps stopped. We stared at each other, holding our breath, but the silence stretched on. Suddenly, there was a loud splash from the lake, followed by a sound like wet, dragging footsteps on the dock. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing the flashlight by the bed. "Are you crazy?" Sandra hissed, but I was already moving. The others must have heard the noise too, because I found Derek and Brian already at the window, peering out toward the lake. "Did you see that?" Derek asked, his voice low. "See what?" Brian pointed. "Something's on the dock." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. At the far end of the dock, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its skin slick and grey, glistening like it had just crawled out of the water. Its head tilted slowly toward us, and even from that distance, I could see its eyes, wide, unblinking, and impossibly black. "Get back inside," I whispered, my voice trembling. We bolted the door and huddled in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. For hours, we listened as the wet footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes stopping by the windows. At one point, I swear I heard it whispering, its voice low and guttural, though I couldn't make out the words. By dawn, the noises stopped. The others wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the car wouldn't start. "Of course," Derek muttered, slamming the hood. We decided to hike back to town, sticking together and avoiding the lake. The air felt heavy, the forest unnaturally quiet. As we reached the main trail, I glanced back toward the cabin. On the shore, standing at the edge of the water, was the figure. It didn't follow us, but I felt its gaze long after we disappeared into the trees. We made it to town and called a tow truck, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had escaped something ancient, something that didn't want us to leave. A week later, I found an article about the lake. It mentioned drownings, disappearances, and local legends about a lake spirit that punished those who disrespected its waters. I don't know what we saw that night, but I'll never go near that lake again. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think I hear it. The soft whisper of water against the shore, and the faint sound of footsteps just outside my window. The vanishing neighbor. My new neighbor had always been peculiar. When I moved into the quaint little cul-de-sac 3 months ago, I barely saw him. He lived in the house directly opposite mine, a stoic 2-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch. I didn't catch his name and never saw anyone visiting. At first, I dismissed his aloofness. Maybe he was shy, or maybe he liked his privacy. But as weeks turned into months, I began to notice oddities. The lights in his house followed no discernible pattern. Sometimes the living room light would flicker on and off in quick, erratic bursts, like Morse code. Other times, the entire house was bathed in darkness for days on end. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I stood at my window, nursing a beer, and stared across the street. His silhouette passed behind his bedroom curtain, a jerky, stuttering motion that made my skin crawl. I decided it wasn't my business and shut the blinds. Until he disappeared. It started subtly. His trash bins sat untouched at the curb for over a week. His mailbox overflowed with letters and flyers. The once sporadic, flickering lights in his house were gone. Every window was dark. On the 12th day of silence, I decided to check on him. I knocked on his door, the sound echoing eerily in the stillness of the street. No answer. I peeked through the front window, but the interior was shrouded in darkness. My unease grew. That night, I sat at my window again, staring at the lifeless house. A gnawing sense of wrongness compelled me to act. I grabbed a flashlight, put on my jacket, and crossed the street. The door was unlocked. I hesitated, heart pounding, but the silence pressed in on me, daring me to enter. The creak of the door as I pushed it open sounded deafening in the quiet night. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing a living room that felt too familiar. It was an exact replica of my own. Every detail was the same. The beige sofa, the coffee table with a small scratch on its edge, the mismatched coasters I had bought at a flea market. Even the framed photograph of my parents sat on the mantel. My breath hitched. I swung the flashlight around, hoping, praying for some logical explanation. But every room I entered mirrored my house, my dining table, my dishes, my unmade bed. The only difference was the shadows. They moved. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light. But as I lingered in the kitchen, I saw them clearly. Faint, wispy shapes that slid along the walls, independent of my flashlight. I backed into the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shadows followed, skittering along the ceiling like dark, restless insects. I stumbled into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down, but the sound of whispering seeped through the cracks. Low, incoherent, growing louder. I whipped open the door, determined to flee, but froze. The shadows had gathered in the living room, coalescing into a single form. It stood at the center of the room, humanoid in shape, but flickering like a faulty projection. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded like dozens speaking at once, it said, "You don't belong here." Cold dread seeped into my bones. "What do you mean?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward me, then another. I bolted. Racing down the stairs, I tripped and nearly fell, but I didn't stop. The shadows surged behind me, their whispers rising to a deafening cacophony. I burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind me, and sprinted back to my house. Once inside, I locked every door and window. My heart didn't slow until the first rays of dawn seeped through the blinds. That morning, I debated calling the police but couldn't imagine how to explain what I'd seen. Instead, I decided to leave a note in his mailbox, urging him to call me if he returned. When I stepped outside, the house across the street was gone. Not empty, gone. The foundation remained, a barren concrete slab littered with debris, but the house itself had vanished. No walls, no roof, no sign it had ever existed. I asked my neighbors about the man who lived there, but they all gave me the same puzzled look. What house? The lot, they insisted, had been empty for years. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. When I opened my eyes, shadows slid along my bedroom walls, creeping closer. And standing in the corner of my room was the figure from the other house. "You don't belong here," it said again. This time I understood. The midnight train. It was just another late night at the office. Deadlines piled up like they always do, and by the time I left, the city had already settled into the eerie stillness of post-midnight. The streets were empty, the cold wind biting against my skin as I hurried to the station. The platform was practically deserted except for a man dozing on a bench and a woman standing at the edge, her face obscured by shadows. I glanced at the digital sign above. The next train was due in 2 minutes. Line 7, the one that would take me straight home. When the train arrived, The door slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped inside. The car was almost empty, save for a few scattered passengers. A young woman in a bright red coat sat with her head bowed, her hands gripping a shopping bag. A man in a suit stared blankly out the window, his face reflecting in the glass. I settled into a seat near the middle, grateful for the quiet. The train lurched forward, its hum soothing in its monotony. I leaned back, closing my eyes for what I thought would be a short ride home. But then I noticed something strange. The train wasn't stopping. We passed by station after station, their names flashing by in a blur. No announcements came over the intercom, and none of the passengers seemed to react. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal, just a blank screen and the time, 12:13 a.m. I looked around, hoping to catch someone's attention. "Excuse me," I said, leaning toward the man in the suit. "Do you know when the next stop is?" He didn't respond. "Sir?" Nothing. He didn't even blink. It was like he hadn't heard me at all. I turned to the woman in the red coat, but she was staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. The train's lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the car. My heart began to race. "Where is this train going?" I said aloud, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. The woman with the shopping bag slowly turned her head toward me. Her lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't words. It was a low, guttural hum, like static on a detuned radio. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The lights flickered again, and when they came back, the train car looked different. The seats were worn and torn, the walls scratched and smeared with dark stains. The windows were black, offering no view of the outside world. Panic set in. I stood, gripping the pole for balance as I made my way to the door at the end of the car. If I could just get to the conductor, maybe I could figure out what was going on. The next car was no better. It was nearly identical, but the passengers were even stranger. A man sat slumped over, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring up at the ceiling. A child sat in the corner, clutching a tattered teddy bear, rocking back and forth without a sound. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the walls. "Stop this train!" No one reacted. I kept moving, car after car, each one more surreal than the last. The passengers grew more grotesque, some with elongated limbs, others with faces that seemed to melt into unrecognizable features. The hum of the train grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in my chest. The air felt heavier, and the temperature dropped, my breath now visible in white puffs. Finally, I reached the front of the train. The door to the conductor's cabin was locked. I pounded on it. "Let me in! What's going on?" The hum deepened, almost like a growl. The door slid open, but the cabin was empty. No conductor, no controls, just a single worn-out chair bolted to the floor and a cracked window overlooking nothing but darkness. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I backed out of the cabin. The hum grew louder, transforming into a cacophony of whispers. "Freddie!" I whipped around. The voice was faint but familiar. "Freddie!" It was my mother's voice. "Mom!" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible din. Faces began to appear in the windows. Pale, ghostly visages pressed against the glass, their eyes wide and unblinking. "Let me off this train!" I screamed, clawing at the nearest door. But it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the train jolted, throwing me to the floor. The lights flickered violently, plunging the car into a strobe-like chaos. The passengers began to move, their jerky, unnatural motions like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. They all turned to face me, their empty eyes locking onto mine. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices a haunting chorus. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling back toward the rear of the train. The cars seemed to stretch endlessly now, a labyrinth of flickering lights and grotesque figures. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent. "Freddie, stay with us." When I finally reached the last car, I found a door. A rusted metal door with a glowing red exit sign above it. Without hesitation, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open, and I was met with a blinding light. The hum of the train ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. I stepped through, and suddenly, I was back on the platform where I'd started. The train was gone, the tracks silent and empty. But something was different. The platform was cracked and overgrown, the digital sign above shattered and unreadable. The air smelled of rust and decay. And then I noticed the shadows, twisting, shifting forms crawling along the edges of the platform, their hollow eyes watching me. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. I don't know how I made it out, but I haven't been back since. Every night, though, I hear it. The hum of the train, faint but unmistakable, calling me back to finish the ride. The Watcher in the Storm. It started with the storm. I'd seen plenty of storms before, ones that shook the windows and sent trees swaying. But this one was different. The lightning came fast and sharp, slicing through the black sky in relentless waves. The thunder was constant, like cannon fire shaking our little house to its core. My mom, dad, little brother Jake and I were huddled in the living room. The power had gone out an hour earlier, so we lit a few candles and tried to pass the time. Jake was doodling in his notebook. Mom was knitting, and Dad was flipping through an old paperback. I was bored out of my mind. With no Wi-Fi or phone signal, there was nothing to do. That's when I remembered the attic. We'd moved into the house 6 months ago, and the attic was one of those places we never got around to fully exploring. Boxes from the previous owners still sat in messy piles, collecting dust. I'd been meaning to check it out, but life kept getting in the way. "Where are you going, Mia?" Mom asked as I stood up. "Just upstairs," I said. "I want to see if there's anything interesting in the attic." "Be careful on those stairs," Dad called after me. The attic stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew cooler as I ascended. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was exactly as I remembered, cluttered, dusty, and full of forgotten relics. I rifled through a few boxes, finding old books, broken picture frames, and even a creepy porcelain doll. But then something caught my eye. It was an old telescope, tucked away in the corner. Its brass frame was tarnished, and the tripod looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Intrigued, I dragged it into the center of the attic and pointed the flashlight at it. The telescope's lens was intact, though cloudy with grime. A quick wipe with my sleeve cleared it up. "Cool," I muttered. I adjusted the tripod and aimed the telescope at the small window at the far end of the attic. The glass was streaked with rain, but I could still make out the yard below, illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. The first thing I saw was the swing set swaying in the wind. Then the old oak tree, its branches twisting and bending under the storm. And then I froze. There was someone standing in the yard. The figure was tall and shadowy, their face obscured by the rain. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring up at the house. A shiver ran down my spine. I lowered the telescope and squinted through the window, but there was no one there. I looked through the telescope again. The figure was still there. "Mia!" Jake's voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. "What?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "Mom says you need to come back downstairs. The storm's getting worse." I hesitated, my heart racing as I took one last glance through the telescope. The figure hadn't moved. It was still staring. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I followed Jake downstairs, my mind racing. Should I tell them what I saw? Would they even believe me? I decided against it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing games. But the figure haunted me. Even as we sat together in the candlelit living room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, Jake fell asleep on the couch, and Mom and Dad went to bed. I was left alone with my thoughts and the relentless storm outside. I couldn't help myself. I crept back up to the attic, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The telescope was exactly where I'd left it. I took a deep breath and peered through the lens. The figure was gone. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by unease. Where had it gone? As if in answer, lightning lit up the attic, and I spun around, my heart pounding. The window at the far end rattled in its frame, but there was nothing there. I returned to the telescope, adjusting its focus. This time I aimed it at the far edge of the yard, near the tree line. There it was, closer now. The figure was standing just beyond the swing set, its head tilted as if trying to see me more clearly. I stumbled back, knocking over a box. The noise echoed in the attic and I froze, my breath hitching. That's when I heard it, a tap, then another. It was coming from the attic window. My flashlight beam darted to the glass, but there was nothing there, just rain and darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. "Mia, what's wrong?" Mum's voice called groggily from her bedroom. "Nothing," I lied, slamming the attic door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, closer, staring, unblinking. By morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside looked almost normal. But when I glanced at the yard through the kitchen window, my stomach dropped. The grass was trampled in a path leading straight to the house. And there, in the mud beneath the attic window, were footprints. Huge, human-like footprints. They didn't stop at the window. They stopped at the door. I never went into the attic again. The room that wasn't there. When we moved into the old Victorian house on Blackwood Lane, I wasn't exactly thrilled. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful, with its wraparound porch, stained glass windows, and turret that made it look like something out of a fairy tale. But at 16, I didn't care about charm or history. I just missed the city, my friends, and everything familiar. The house was massive, more space than our family of 4 needed. My parents were over the moon about it, though. "Think of all the possibilities," my mum kept saying. My younger brother Tommy was equally excited, running through the halls like a kid in a candy store. Then there was the attic. On our first day, we decided to explore. The attic was enormous, with slanted ceilings and a single dusty window overlooking the backyard. Old trunks and furniture were scattered around, but what caught my attention was the door on the far wall. It was small, barely tall enough for an adult to pass through without ducking. What made it strange was how out of place it looked. The wood was darker than the rest of the attic, and the handle was rusted, like it had been untouched for decades. "Must have been a storage closet," Dad said when I pointed it out. "Doesn't look like it's in the blueprints," Mom added, flipping through a stack of papers. That should have been a red flag, but we shrugged it off. It was just an old door in an old house. The door didn't open, of course. The knob wouldn't budge, and there was no keyhole. Tommy tried kicking it, but all he got was a sore foot. "Maybe it's better left locked," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. If only I'd known how true that was. A few weeks passed, and we settled into the house. Life was uneventful, except for the occasional creak or groan from the old wood. But then things started to get weird. It began with the noises. At first, they were faint, soft tapping sounds that could easily be blamed on squirrels or the wind. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, scraping like nails on wood. One night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps overhead. "Tommy?" I whispered, thinking he might have snuck up there. But when I peeked into his room, he was sound asleep. The real trouble began when the door opened. It was a Saturday night, and I was home alone with Tommy. Mom and Dad had gone to a dinner party, leaving us with strict instructions to behave. I was in my room, scrolling on my phone, when I heard Tommy scream. I bolted upstairs, my heart pounding. He was in the attic, standing in front of the door. Only now, it wasn't locked. It was open. "What did you do?" I demanded. "Nothing," he cried, his face pale. "It just opened." Inside was a room I swear hadn't been there before. It was larger than it should have been, considering the size of the house. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with objects that looked like they belonged in a museum. An old doll with cracked porcelain skin, a brass telescope, a pocket watch, and more. "What is this?" Tommy whispered, stepping inside. "I don't think we should..." Before I could finish, the door slammed shut behind us. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic. Tommy grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room. "See what?" "That!" He pointed, his hand trembling. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then one of them moved. It wasn't like a person shifting in the dark. It was more fluid, like smoke curling in the air. But there was weight to it, a sense of presence that made my skin crawl. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling Tommy toward the door. It wouldn't open. I yanked the handle, pounded on the wood, screamed for help, but the door didn't budge. Behind us, the shadow grew larger, more defined. It stretched upward, forming what looked like a figure cloaked in darkness. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, if you could call it that, and pointed at the shelves. Tommy, against all logic, stepped closer. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He reached out and picked up the pocket watch. The moment he touched it, the air around us shifted. The room blurred, and for a brief second, I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was standing in a small, dimly lit room. A man sat at a desk, his head in his hands. He looked up at me, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. "Don't take it," he whispered. Then I was back in the attic, Tommy shaking my arm. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice high-pitched with panic. Before I could answer, the shadow lunged. I don't know how to describe what happened next. It wasn't like being attacked by a person or an animal. It was like the darkness itself enveloped us, cold and suffocating. I heard Tommy screaming, felt myself being pulled backward, and then, when I woke up, the door was closed again. Tommy was beside me, pale but breathing. The room was gone. We stumbled downstairs, too shaken to speak. When Mom and Dad got home, they found us huddled in the living room, refusing to explain what had happened. The next day, the door was gone. The wall where it had been was now seamless, as if it had never existed. We moved out of the house a month later. To this day, Tommy and I don't talk about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the attic. I hear the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of shadows, and the voice of the man who warned me. Don't take it. The sound below. Caves have always fascinated me. The way they twist and turn, revealing secrets hidden from the surface world. So when my best friend Nate invited me on a spelunking trip to Echo Rift, a remote cave system in the middle of nowhere, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Nate was a seasoned spelunker, and I trusted him to lead us through the labyrinthine depths. The cave system had only recently been mapped, and rumours swirled about its eerie acoustics. Locals whispered about strange sounds that drifted up from the depths, but Nate dismissed it as folklore. Wind, he said, or water dripping into pools. Caves do weird things to sound. We arrived at the entrance just before dawn, accompanied by Nate's girlfriend Cara and her brother Liam. The hike to the cave had been grueling, and the jagged black mouth of Echo Rift loomed like an open wound in the landscape. "Let's do this," Nate said, grinning as he switched on his headlamp. The first few hours were uneventful, filled with the familiar sounds of clinking gear and the crunch of gravel underfoot. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint metallic tang of minerals. Nate led the way, marking our path with chalk while Cara and Liam followed, chatting quietly. I brought up the rear, marveling at the beauty of the cave walls, their surfaces shimmering with crystalline deposits. We descended steadily, the tunnels narrowing and twisting until the light from the entrance was a distant memory. It was somewhere near the second chamber, a cavern with a ceiling so high our headlamps couldn't touch it that we first heard it. A soft hum. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at Nate, who had stopped mid-step. "You hear that?" I asked. "Probably just air currents," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Cara and Liam exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything as we pressed on. The hum grew louder as we descended, transforming into what sounded like distant singing. It wasn't the chaotic melody of nature, the whistle of wind, or the drip of water, but something deliberate. The notes were low and mournful, weaving together in a haunting harmony. We paused in a narrow passage, the sound reverberating around us. "Okay, that's definitely not the wind," Liam said, his voice shaky. "Maybe there's an opening to the surface somewhere," Nate suggested, though he looked uneasy. "It could be people above ground." "It doesn't sound like it's coming from above," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's below us." Cara hugged herself, glancing nervously at the tunnel ahead. "Let's turn back. We've gone deep enough." But Nate shook his head. "Come on, this is what we came for. To explore. If it gets too dangerous, we'll stop." Reluctantly, we followed him deeper into the cave. The song grew clearer. The voices, yes, it was voices now, sounding more distinct. They were impossibly smooth, alien in their precision, and they seemed to beckon us forward. We reached a steep descent, a jagged slope that led into an abyss our lights couldn't penetrate. Nate rigged up a rope, and one by one we climbed down. The singing enveloped us now, rich and layered, but still impossible to place. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply other. At the bottom of the slope, we found ourselves in a massive cavern. The walls glittered like they were coated in frost, and the air was thick, almost syrupy. In the center of the cavern was a pool of water, so still it could have been glass. The singing seemed to come from the pool. "Do you see that?" Kara whispered, pointing at the water. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The surface of the pool rippled, though there was no breeze, no disturbance. As I stared, a faint light glowed beneath the water, shifting and swirling like something alive. "Let's get out of here," Liam said, his voice rising with panic. "This isn't normal." "Wait," Nate said, stepping closer to the pool. "We need to document this. It's incredible." He crouched by the edge, pulling out his phone to record. As he aimed the camera at the water, the light beneath the surface intensified. The singing grew louder, the harmonies now vibrating through my bones. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but the sound held me frozen, spellbound. And then, something broke the surface. It was a hand, long and skeletal, with translucent skin stretched taut over spindly bones. It reached for Nate with terrifying speed, grasping his wrist. He screamed, dropping his phone as he struggled to pull away, but the hand was impossibly strong. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. Liam and I lunged forward, grabbing Nate's other arm and pulling with all our strength. The water churned violently, and more hands emerged, clawing at the air. Their fingers were too long, their nails sharp as razors, and their movements were jerky, almost insect-like. "Pull!" I shouted, my voice raw. With a final desperate tug, we wrenched Nate free. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, which was already swelling and turning an angry red. The hands retreated into the water, but the light below burned brighter, casting grotesque shadows on the cavern walls. "We need to leave. Now," I said, grabbing Nate and hauling him toward the rope. The singing shifted, the harmonious melody turning discordant and violent. It wasn't a song anymore, it was a scream. We scrambled up the rope, my arms burning with the effort. The sound followed us, echoing through the tunnels, growing louder and more frantic. It felt alive, pressing against my skull, clawing at my sanity. We ran, our headlamps bouncing wildly as we navigated the dark passages. The singing, or screaming, never ceased, and every so often, I thought I saw shadows moving in the corner of my eye. Once, I swore I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle. By the time we reached the entrance, we were breathless and shaking. The moment we stepped into the open air, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. Back at the campsite, Nate sat by the fire, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. His skin was pale, and he wouldn't meet our eyes. Liam tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal, and the GPS was dead. As the night wore on, Nate's condition worsened. His veins darkened, spreading like ink beneath his skin, and his breathing grew shallow. He muttered under his breath, words I couldn't understand, but they sounded familiar, like the singing. Kara kept watch, but exhaustion overtook us all eventually. When I woke, the sun was rising and Nate was gone. We searched the area, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. Only his phone remained, lying on the edge of the campfire, its screen cracked but still recording. The video showed us descending into the cavern. The singing was faint but audible. But as the footage continued, the sound grew louder, more distorted, until it was nothing but static. And then, In the final frame, a face appeared. A pale, hollow-eyed face, staring directly into the camera. We packed up and left that morning, swearing never to speak of it again. But at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear it, the sound below, calling me back. You've stayed till the end, brave soul. Bloody subscribe, and I'll see you in your nightmares. Good night.